Montana Territory. December 1882. The storm hit just before dusk, wild and mean, slamming into the Bitterroot Valley like it had a score to settle. Tobias Boone gripped the reins tighter as the wind howled through the pine trees, snow blinding his path. His horse, Rosie, snorted and pushed forward, hooves dragging through deepening drifts. He could barely see the cabin. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. His heart pounded. He burst through the door, snow blowing in behind him. The fire was out. The cradle was empty. "June," he called, voice cracking. "June." But she was gone. They found her body 3 days later, curled beneath a pine not far from the creek. She must have gone out searching for him when he was caught in the storm, their baby son still warm in her arms. The child had not survived either. Tobias buried them side by side beneath the frozen earth. He carved their names into a pine cross with a shaking hand, then stopped speaking for a long time after that. By spring, folks in Darby barely remembered the man who used to laugh easy and bring his wife sugar candy from Missoula every trip down. Tobias kept to himself. He rode fence. He fixed what needed fixing. He answered when spoken to, but never said more than he had to. The land was quiet, and so was he. It was the end of March when the wagon pulled up to the old Weller place, half a mile down from Tobias's spread. The house had been empty 2 winters now. He was riding back from checking stock when he saw the woman struggling to unhitch the team. A little girl sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees. The woman turned at the sound of his horse. She was tall, with a narrow waist and strong shoulders. Her coat was too thin for the chill still in the air, her cheeks red from the wind. "Afternoon," she said, brushing hair from her face. "I'm Katrina Keller. Just moved in." Tobias tipped his hat. "Tobias Boone. That road gets muddy up here. You make it all right." "Barely," she said, glancing at the rutted track behind her. "But we're here." Her eyes landed on the child. "This is my daughter, Millie." Millie looked up. She had a small face, pale and sharp-eyed, like a sparrow watching from a fence post. "Howdy, Millie," Tobias said gently. She gave a quiet nod and looked back at her boots. "They sent us from Missoula," Katrina said, voice brisk. "Said this homestead was left unpaid and up for claim. I took it." "You and your husband?" "No husband," she said quickly. "Just us." He nodded. He was not one to pry. "You'll want to keep that fire stoked at night," Tobias said. "This cold lingers past when you think it ought to let go." "I figured," Katrina said. "We'll manage." But they did not nod at first. A week later, Tobias found Millie sitting on his porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, face pinched from cold. "My mama's sick," she whispered, "and the fire went out." He did not ask questions. He threw his coat over her shoulders and rode like hell for their place. Katrina was fevered, her breathing shallow, face damp with sweat. He got the fire roaring, boiled water, fed her spoonfuls of broth when she could swallow. It took 2 days before the color came back to her face. During that time, Tobias kept Millie close, cooking her beans and cornbread, showing her how to feed the chickens and draw water from the well. When Katrina could sit up, she looked at him from the bed with raw eyes. "You did not have to help us." "I know," Tobias said. "You hardly know us." "I know that too." She looked at her daughter, asleep on the rug near the stove. "Thank you." He only nodded, but something in his chest felt like it had been waiting for that moment, for the sound of another voice in his house, for the small weight of a child's head resting on his knee as she listened to him read from the worn Bible his wife had once held. Katrina stayed quiet the first few days after her fever broke. She watched Tobias fix the broken hinge on her back door. Watched him churn butter with Millie, his big hands showing hers the rhythm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and pink over the valley, She stepped outside and found him chopping wood. "You always help strangers like this?" He split a log clean through. "Not usually." She smiled a little. "So what made you help us?" He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, quiet but thick with meaning. "You looked like you needed someone," he said. She swallowed. "We did." He nodded toward the cabin. "You staying?" She hesitated. "If I can make it work." "You will," he said, with a calm certainty that surprised her. They fell into a rhythm after that. Tobias checked in every few days, bringing sacks of flour or slabs of salt pork when he came from town. Millie followed him like a shadow. She learned to ride a pony he had once bought for a child who never got to sit on it. One morning, Katrina stood beside him at the fence line, both of them watching Millie chase chickens in the yard. "She has not laughed like that in a long time," Katrina said softly. Tobias glanced at her. "She is a good kid." "She is," Katrina said, then looked up at him. "You are good with her." He did not speak, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, how his hand gripped the rail. She reached out, gently touching his arm. "You lost someone?" He nodded. "My wife, and our baby boy, 2 winters ago." Katrina's eyes filled. "I am sorry." He looked away. "I reckon I stopped feeling much of anything for a while after that. Just kept going." She stepped closer. "But you helped us." He met her eyes. "Because you brought something back." They stood in silence, spring wind brushing past them. Tobias had not felt warmth like this in 2 years, not just the sun, but the quiet presence of someone beside him who did not expect anything, who just stood with him, steady and real. Later that evening, Millie curled up in a blanket near the stove, and Katrina stayed at the table while Tobias finished his coffee. "I do not know what you want from all this," she said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, looking down at her hands, "you have done so much, and we have so little to give." He set his cup down. "You gave me back something I thought I lost." She raised her eyes. "What?" "A reason to come home." She blinked, and for a moment, the air between them felt different. Not heavy, not sad, just full of something new, something waiting. Tobias stood. "You and Millie are always welcome here. You are not alone anymore." Katrina rose, her shoulders lifting like she had been carrying too much for too long. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You do not have to thank me." She leaned into his touch, just a little. "Maybe I want to." He smiled, soft and sure. "Then I will take it." And for the first time in years, Tobias Boone felt the stirrings of something he had not dared believe in again: hope. The first good rain came in early April, soft and steady, loosening what the frost had held down since October. The mountains still wore snow on their peaks, but below, the land began to breathe again. Tobias stood in the barn doorway, oil lantern in hand, watching the sky darken to slate. Behind him, the horses shifted, hooves muffled in straw. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of rain until it came back. He heard footsteps in the wet grass before he saw her. Katrina approached with a wool shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, the hem of her skirt damp from walking. She didn't speak right away, just stepped inside the barn and let the door swing shut behind her. "I was hoping you'd be around," she said, brushing her hair back. "You all right?" he asked, setting the lantern on a hook. "Millie's with Mrs. Talbot. She invited her over to help shell peas." Katrina leaned against the stall wall. "I thought I'd check if you needed help with anything." He gave a small nod. "I was about to bring in the tack from the fence line. Been meaning to oil the bridles." "I can do that." He handed her one and watched as she moved with practiced ease, settling onto an overturned crate and opening the tin of saddle soap. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and when she worked, Her jaw shifted slightly from side to side, concentration etched into every motion. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the rain on the roof and the soft creak of leather under their palms. Then she looked up. "I used to do this with my father," she said. "When he wasn't off working the timber camps. He'd bring home busted harnesses and have me help fix them." Said it taught patience. Tobias glanced at her fingers, slick with oil. "I'd say it stuck. I don't know. I got tired of waiting for people to come back." She smiled faintly, but her hands didn't stop. "I think that's why I left Missoula." He didn't press. He just listened. After a while, she set the bridle aside and folded her hands. "I wasn't sure what kind of man I'd meet out here. Folks in town talked about you like you were part of the land. Quiet. Hard to know." He rested his elbows on his knees. "Still feel that way?" She gave a small shake of her head. "No. You're steady. And kind in a way that sneaks up on you." His throat tightened at that. He hadn't expected kindness to matter anymore, not his, not anyone else's. She stood and moved to the barn door, resting her hand on the edge. "I didn't mean to take up your evening." "You didn't," he said. "You're welcome here, anytime." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You always say that." "That's because I mean it." Her eyes lingered on his a moment longer. Then she stepped out into the rain. That night, Tobias couldn't sleep. The bed felt too wide again, the quiet too loud. He got up before dawn and saddled Rosie with care, heading out toward the north ridge where the creek wound through the cottonwoods. He didn't expect to find Millie there, but he did, perched on a boulder, watching the water. She turned when she heard his horse, face pale in the early light. "I didn't wander far," she said quickly. "Mama knows I'm here." He dismounted and sat beside her. "You come here often?" She nodded. "It's quiet. I like the sound of the water." He studied her profile. She didn't fidget the way most children did. She sat still, eyes focused. "You remind me of someone," he said. She looked at him. "Your son." "No," he said gently. "Your mother." Millie tilted her head. "She says I worry too much." "Maybe, but that's not a bad thing. Worry means you care." She was quiet for a long moment. "She's been sad since Papa left. I try not to make it worse." Tobias felt something tighten in his chest. "You don't make anything worse, Millie. You help just by being you." She didn't respond, but after a moment, she leaned against his arm, just a little. He stayed still, letting her. By midday, they returned to the house. Katrina was cleaning fish by the back step, sleeves damp, hair tied back with a strip of muslin. She looked up, relief flashing in her eyes when she saw them. "I told her it was all right," she said. "But when she didn't come back right away." "She was fine," Tobias said. "We sat by the creek a while." Katrina nodded, then reached for a second knife and handed it to him. "You ever cleaned brook trout?" "Plenty." They worked side by side, the fish slick and cold in their hands. He watched how she hummed under her breath, a tune he didn't recognize but liked anyhow. When the last fish was wrapped and set aside, she wiped her hands and looked at him. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about staying through winter, maybe longer." He held her gaze. "What's holding you back?" "I'm not sure anything is." She looked toward the hills, where the clouds had begun to break. "I've just never had a reason to stay anywhere before. Maybe now you do." She looked back at him, and the way her eyes softened made something settle deep in his chest. That evening, as dusk gathered and Millie curled on a cot near the fire, Tobias poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Katrina. "Warm enough for you?" he asked. She took a sip. "It's getting there." He sat beside her, their shoulders close but not touching, the heat from the fire brushing their knees. "I never thought I'd want anything more again," he said after a while. Not after losing them. Katrina looked at him, her voice low. And now, he met her eyes. Now I think I might. She didn't speak, but she reached over and laid her hand gently over his. He turned his palm up, lacing their fingers together. Neither of them moved for a long time. There was no need. By the time June had fully given way to July, the valley had turned rich and green, with the scent of warm earth rising in the still afternoons. Days stretched long under a sky so blue it looked painted, and the creek ran slower now, its banks crowded with wildflowers and buzzing insects. Tobias had begun waking with a quiet purpose, no longer counting the hours, but meeting them. Katrina walked with him most mornings after the chores were done. Millie often trailing behind with a basket and a hunger for anything she hadn't seen the day before. Their steps found the rhythm of the land slow, patient, lasting. One afternoon, Tobias was repairing a wheel on the buckboard while Katrina sat on the stoop with a worn shirt spread across her lap, darning the cuffs. Millie was lying belly down in the grass nearby, drawing in the dirt with a twig. Katrina didn't look up when she spoke. You ever think about leaving the valley? He tightened the last spoke with a wrench, then sat back on his heels. I used to think I might. After that winter, seemed like nothing out here was worth staying for. She paused in her stitching. And now? He ran a hand down the back of his neck, eyes lifting toward the ridge where the pines stood in still rows. Now I'm not sure I could breathe right anywhere else. Katrina set the shirt aside and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I grew up in Helena, lived in Missoula before we came here. I thought I'd find something waiting in each place. But it was always just making do. That what you're doing now? He asked. She looked at him then, with a steadiness that made the air feel different. No, not anymore. Millie called out just then, waving the twig in the air. I found a snake skin. Tobias chuckled and stood, brushing dust from his trousers. Just don't bring it in the house. Later that evening, after supper had been cleared and Millie was asleep in the side room, Katrina stepped out onto the porch with 2 mugs in her hands. Tobias had been sitting there in the dark, watching the stars come out one by one. She handed him a mug and sat beside him, their knees just barely touching. I've been thinking about the fence, she said, watching a bat flit over the yard, the post near the pastures leaning in. If it falls, the goats'll wander. Could come by tomorrow. We'll fix it together. She nodded, quiet for a moment. You always say we. You don't have to. He turned his head. I want to. She looked down into her mug. I wasn't expecting to build anything again. Not really. After Millie's father left, I figured I'd raise her best I could. Keep moving if I had to. But this place. It feels like something I didn't even know I needed. He reached over and covered her hand with his. You don't have to keep moving. Not unless you want to. She didn't pull away. What if I want to stay? Then stay, he said. With me. Here. Her fingers laced through his, and she leaned into his shoulder. You sure? I'm more certain of this than anything I've been in years. They sat that way for a long time, the night warm around them, the quiet alive with crickets and the soft sound of the trees. The next morning, Tobias hitched the team and hauled wood down from the ridge. When he returned, Katrina was in his kitchen, flour dusted on her cheek, kneading dough with strong, sure hands. Millie was at the table, peeling apples into a tin basin. He set the wood by the door, then stood there a moment watching them. Millie looked up. Are you staying for dinner? He smiled. I was hoping to. Good, she said, returning to her task. Mama makes the best biscuits now. Katrina glanced over her shoulder. I told her that's only because you taught me how to get the stove to hold even heat. He stepped into the room, the scent of yeast and cinnamon curling through the air. I just showed you where the drafts were. You did the rest. She turned to face him fully. I've been thinking about what we're building here. It isn't just about surviving the next winter. He nodded. No, it's about living through it. Together. She reached for his hand. Then let's start planning for it. Really planning. Not just passing days. He squeezed her fingers. We can build something good here. Steady. And warm, she said, her smile slow and sure. Warm enough to last. He leaned in, kissed her brow, and when she looked up at him, he kissed her mouth soft, certain, and full of all the quiet promise he'd kept locked away through seasons of grief. She kissed him back, without hesitance. Millie cleared her throat loudly. If you're done with all that, the apples are ready. Katrina laughed, and Tobias felt it in his ribs like music. He reached for the basin. Then I guess we'd better get to it. Can't waste a single thing that's worth keeping. And none of them meant just the apples. By late July, the fields near the creek were thick with thistle and tall grass, the kind that brushed against Tobias's boots when he walked the southern edge of the property. He'd never let it get that overgrown before, but now he found himself letting some things be, letting the land soften in places, as if it too was learning how to live with something new. That morning, Katrina had risen early to beat the heat while she worked in the garden. The sun wasn't yet over the ridge, and already the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sweet blooming near the fence line. Tobias stood at the edge of the porch, watching her kneel among the squash vines, sleeves rolled, hair pinned up with a single carved comb. Something's been digging near the roots, she said, glancing up as he approached. I found claw marks. Could be raccoons. Maybe a badger. Will it come back? Not if I run a wire and hang cloth with turpentine. The smell drives them off. She wiped her hands on her apron. You always know what to do. He crouched beside her and ran his fingers through the turned soil. Not always, but I've learned to pay attention. She sat back on her heels and studied his face. You don't talk much about how you learn things. I used to think knowing how to fix a thing was enough. Didn't matter where the knowing came from. But it does. He looked at her then, the light catching in her eyes. I learned most of it from my father. He worked cattle in Texas before we moved up this way. Hard man. Not cruel but quiet. Expected things to be done right. Did he live to see you marry? No. Died in the spring before it. He never met her. Katrina rested her hand lightly on his forearm. Would he have liked her? Tobias nodded. She'd have changed his mind about a lot of things. They fell into silence, the wind stirring the tall grass. Then Katrina stood, brushing dust from her skirt. I've been thinking about building a smokehouse, she said. We'll need one if we're staying through the next winter. I can help frame it, he said. But you'll have to show me how you cure meat. Mine always dries too hard. She arched a brow. You're asking me for advice? I've seen you salt pork with your eyes closed and not waste a speck. That drew a quiet laugh from her, low and warm. All right then. I'll show you. Later that day, they rode into town with Millie in the wagon bed, her knees tucked under her chin and a sack of wool scraps in her lap. Tobias handled the reins, Katrina beside him, her hat tied beneath her chin with a strip of faded blue calico. The horse moved at an easy pace, hooves kicking up dust from the dry road. Do you come into Derby often? She asked. Only when there's something I can't fix myself. Like what? He thought a moment. Glass panes, wire, coffee. She smiled. That's a short list. I don't need much. She glanced at him. You do now. He turned to look at her, but she held his gaze steady, not teasing, just true. At the general store, while Tobias loaded supplies, Katrina took Millie to the dry goods counter. She picked out a small tin of rose hip salve and a length of muslin. On the way back to the wagon, she pressed the tin into Tobias's palm. "For your hands," she said. "The calluses are splitting." He studied it, then her. "I wouldn't have thought to ask." "You don't have to." They rode home in the long hush of late afternoon, crickets beginning their song in the tall weeds. When they reached the cabin, Tobias lifted Millie down from the wagon, then offered his hand to Katrina. She took it without hesitation, her fingers curling around his with quiet conviction. That night, after Millie had gone to bed and the dishes were stacked to dry, Katrina stepped out onto the porch in her stockings, the boards cool beneath her feet. Tobias joined her, holding his coffee in both hands. "You ever think about building onto the house?" she asked. "I've thought about it." She turned to him. "Would you, if it meant you and Millie had a place that felt like it was yours too?" "Yes." Katrina looked out across the yard, where the moonlight silvered the tops of the grass. "I want to raise her somewhere steady, not just safe but known. I never had that." "You do now," he said. She was quiet a long time before she turned to face him. "I want to make a life with you, Tobias. I want to grow old watching the seasons change from this porch." His breath caught, but he didn't speak right away. He set his cup down and reached for her hands. "I never imagined I'd find this again," he said. "I didn't think I deserved to." "You do," she whispered. "So do I." He drew her closer, their foreheads touching, the space between them folded into nothing. She rested her hands on his chest, steady and sure. "I'll build the addition before first frost," he said. "And we'll smoke venison together come fall." She smiled, eyes shining in the dark. "And plant winter squash, and mend quilts together when the wind rises." "We'll do it all," he said, "together." And when he kissed her, it was not rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that came after long silences had said everything that needed saying. It was the first of many, and the start of something neither of them would ever have to survive alone again. August came with the sharp scent of ripe hay and the hum of bees thick in the air. Tobias had started rising before dawn again, not from habit or grief, but because the days filled fast now boards to cut, a lean-to roof, a new corner of life to shape. The addition was half raised behind the cabin, its frame catching morning light like a promise made visible. Katrina had taken to keeping a ledger in the evenings, not of money, but of what they planted, preserved, and built. She kept it tucked beside the Bible she read from aloud each Sunday, Millie nestled at her side. Her handwriting had a quiet order to it, straight lines and firm loops, like everything else she touched. One afternoon, Tobias returned from the ridge with his shirt clinging to his back and a bundle of pine boards tied over Rosie. He found Katrina in the back room, standing beside a measuring string she'd stretched along the new wall. "You want the window here?" he asked, setting the boards down. "I do," she said, not turning. "It'll face the cottonwoods. I like how the wind moves through them just before rain." He stepped beside her. "You'll be able to see the creek from it too." She folded the string and slipped it into her apron. "I thought this room could be ours." He looked at her, the weight of that word settling in him like a stone in clear water. "I'd like that. I've never had a bedroom all my own before," she said, voice quiet. "Not one built for me." He touched her shoulder. "Then we'll make it right. Floor straight, roof tight, walls thick enough to hold in the heat come January." "I believe you," she said, and she meant it. Millie came in before supper with bramble scratches on her arms and a handful of wild plums, sticky juice running down her wrists. Tobias fetched a basin and helped her clean up, Katrina watching from the porch with the soft look she wore when no one else was watching her. Later, the three of them sat out back, a candle stub glowing between them, while the wind shifted dry grass and the sky faded into stars. Tobias carved a piece of cedar for Millie's new spindle, handing it to her with a nod of approval. She turned it in her hands, quietly pleased. "I want to learn to spin like Mrs. Talbot," she said. "You'll manage it," Katrina told her. "You've got good hands." Tobias added, "And patience. That counts more than you think." Millie yawned and leaned against her mother. Her eyes closed before long, her breath evening out under the shawl Katrina tucked around her. Katrina turned to Tobias. "You've been thinking." "I have," he said. "I want to marry you." She didn't blink or smile too quickly. Just studied him, her voice steady as a bell. "You sure that's not just kindness talking?" "It's not kindness," he said. "It's wanting to wake beside you every morning. To call this home not just mine, but ours. I've known grief. I've known loneliness. But what I feel with you is not about filling emptiness. It's about building something new." Her hand found his, fingers lacing slow and certain. "Then I'll marry you. I want that too." They wed on a Sunday near the end of the month, just as the cottonwoods turned pale at the edges. Reverend Lyle married them beneath the big sycamore near the creek, with a handful of neighbors standing quiet in the shade. Katrina wore a blue dress with a white collar, and Millie carried a posy of goldenrod and sage. Tobias didn't say much during the small meal that followed, but his hand never left Katrina's. He watched her with a reverence that didn't need words. That evening, when the guests had gone and the sun had fallen behind the hills, Tobias and Katrina stood together in the new room. It was finished now, chinked tight, the floor planed smooth, the window fitted with glass carried all the way from Missoula. He lit a lamp and set it on the sill. "I want you to feel rooted here," he said, "even when the wind comes hard." "I do," she said, "because this was built with care, with intention." He reached for her hand. "With love." She stepped closer. "Yes, with love." They lay close that night, no space left between them, her hand resting over his heart, his fingers brushing her spine. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, but the house held steady. The first frost came in mid-September, thin and silvery over the grass. The smokehouse stood ready, the root cellar full. Katrina's preserves lined the shelves in neat rows: pear butter, pickled onions, rhubarb jam. Millie had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, her voice growing stronger with each page. They passed winter with warmth and ease. Tobias taught Millie to whittle. Katrina showed Tobias how to make soap with lye and ash. The days were quiet but never empty. They learned what it meant to be content. By spring, the cabin had a front garden with lavender and beans growing side by side. Tobias built a rocker for the porch, and Katrina quilted a coverlet from scraps of their old clothes. Millie started school in town, riding in with the Talbots on Mondays and returning Fridays full of stories. One warm evening in May, Tobias sat on the porch steps with his hands wrapped around his knees. Katrina came out with a basin of water and a towel, kneeling beside him. "You've been digging fence posts all day," she said. "Worth it," he replied. "We'll need the new pen for the lambs." She washed his hands gently, thumb brushing the creases in his palm. "You built a life out of nothing." He looked up at her. "Not nothing. I had the land, and a good horse, and time." She smiled and leaned down to kiss him, slow and certain. "And now you have me, and I'm never letting go," he said. They sat there until the stars came out, the porch creaking gently beneath them, the night warm and sure around their shoulders. Inside the house, Millie turned down the lamp by the window and pulled the curtain, knowing they'd come in when they were ready. And they did together, always carrying the quiet strength of the life they'd built, and the deep, steady joy of knowing they would never have to walk it alone again.